On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Court House, about 95 miles west of the Confederate capital, Richmond. After 4 years of bloody civil war, the meeting signaled the collapse of the Confederacy and the preservation of the United States as a single nation. The surrender did not officially end the war, but it effectively destroyed Southern hopes of victory. At the same time, the generous terms that General Grant offered General Lee signaled the possibility of reconciliation. By the spring of 1865, Lee's soldiers were running out of food, ammunition, horses, and manpower. Desertions increased, supplies disappeared, and many soldiers could barely continue marching. When Union forces broke through Confederate defenses in early April, Richmond and Petersburg fell. The Confederate government abandoned the capital and fled south. When Lee attempted a retreat toward Danville, he was cut off by Philip Sheridan and the Union cavalry. The Confederate commander was forced to move his troops toward Lynchburg. Grant moved quickly to prevent the escape. Union troops repeatedly marched ahead of Lee's retreating army and blocked every possible route. On the morning of April 9th, Confederate forces made one final attempt to break through Union lines near Appomattox Court House. The attack failed, and Lee realized that further resistance would only bring needless casualties. "There is nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." A meeting was arranged between the two commanders at the home of Wilmer McLean, a merchant who had moved to Appomattox seeking peace after the war disrupted his life elsewhere. In July 1861, McLean had lived near the First Battle of Bull Run. During the fighting, artillery shells struck his property, convincing him to move far from the war. Nearly 4 years later, the war's most famous meeting occurred inside his new home. McLean later joked that the war had begun in his front yard and ended in his parlor. Grant arrived first. Standing 5 feet 8 inches tall, he wore a muddy field uniform. Lee, 6 feet tall, arrived dressed in an immaculate gray uniform, complete with sash and polished sword. Before discussing surrender terms, the generals spent several minutes talking about old comrades and shared experiences from their time serving together during the Mexican-American War. The terms Grant offered were generous. Confederate soldiers would be paroled rather than imprisoned and could return home after promising not to take up arms against the United States again. Grant also allowed Confederate officers to keep their sidearms. Recognizing that spring planting season had arrived, Grant permitted soldiers who owned horses or mules to keep them. Lee responded to the offer. "This will have the best possible effect upon the men and will do much toward conciliating our people." Grant introduced Lee to his staff. The surrender document had been prepared by Lieutenant Colonel Ely S. Parker, Grant's military secretary and a member of the Seneca Nation. Lee noticed Parker and remarked that he was pleased to see one real American present. Parker reportedly replied, "We are all Americans." After the terms were signed, news of the surrender spread rapidly through Union camps. Soldiers erupted in cheers as word passed from regiment to regiment. Grant immediately ordered the celebrations to stop. "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again, and the best sign of rejoicing after the victory will be to abstain from all demonstrations." General Grant ordered 3 days' rations to be delivered to the 25,000 vanquished soldiers who had served General Lee. Lee returned to his army and encouraged his soldiers to obey the surrender terms. He urged them to return home peacefully and begin rebuilding their lives. Many Confederate soldiers wept as they learned that the Army of Northern Virginia would fight no more. 3 days later, a formal surrender ceremony took place. Confederate soldiers marched forward to stack their weapons and flags. Union troops under General Joshua Chamberlain stood in formation to receive them. Chamberlain then ordered his men to salute the defeated Confederates. Confederate General John B. Gordon responded by lowering his sword and bowing from horseback. On hearing the news of Lee's surrender, celebrations in Washington, D.C. broke out, including a 500-gun salute, which filled the city's air with thunder and blue smoke. On Wall Street in New York City, crowds broke out in song, including boisterous renditions of the national anthem. The bloodiest war in American history was effectively over. The nation was relieved. The path to restoration had been heralded by Grant's generous surrender terms. 5 days after the ceremony at Appomattox, however, and just 2 days after Confederate soldiers surrendered their weapons, a single shot was fired in Ford's Theater. The road to reconciliation had faltered. Celebration would now give way to mourning.